The bilateral summit between United States President Donald Trump and Chinese President Xi Jinping convened on May 14, 2026, in Beijing's Great Hall of the People, offered the international community a revealing and consequential window into the structural dynamics of Sino-American relations. Conducted under the scrutiny of governments across the globe, the summit's opening ceremonial exchange immediately disclosed a fundamental asymmetry in strategic posture between the two delegations. President Trump, addressing President Xi before an audience that included senior cabinet officials, technology executives, and the world's media, opened the proceedings by characterizing their relationship in warmly personal terms, calling it an honor to be Xi's friend, and praising him as a great leader. Xi Jinping, by contrast, responded with language that was precise, measured, and unmistakably strategic. He declared that the Taiwan question constituted the most important issue in China-United States relations, warned that improper management of the issue would produce clashes and even conflicts, and invoked the Thucydides trap, a scholarly framework developed by Harvard political scientist Graham Allison to frame the bilateral relationship as one standing at a historically perilous inflection point. This juxtaposition between relational warmth and strategic doctrine, captured in the opening minutes of a summit broadcast to every government on Earth, is not merely symbolic. It is diagnostic of the broader configuration of pressures, leverage, and negotiating architecture that China has carefully constructed across the preceding 75 days of geopolitical turbulence. Any serious analysis of the summit's dynamics must begin with an examination of the two delegations themselves, for their composition communicates intent with a precision that official communiques rarely match. The American delegation featured Secretary of State Marco Rubio, Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, Tesla and SpaceX Chief Executive Officer Elon Musk, Apple Chief Executive Officer Tim Cook, and NVIDIA Chief Executive Officer Jensen Huang. The Chinese delegation, by contrast, comprised Foreign Minister Wang Yi, Commerce Minister Wang Wentao, and Vice Premier for Economic Affairs He Lifeng, career policy officials whose professional mandate is the formulation and defense of state interests. Washington's inclusion of three of the world's most powerful technology and industrial executives signals that the American government arrived in Beijing oriented toward commercial outcomes. Beijing's composition of senior policy officials signals that China arrived to establish terms. The distinction is not trivial. Musk Tesla operates a major manufacturing facility, the Shanghai Gigafactory, within Chinese territory, and is materially dependent on access to Chinese markets, supply chains, and rare earth inputs. Cook's Apple relies on Chinese manufacturing for its most critical production lines. Huang's NVIDIA depends on Chinese-controlled manufacturing nodes throughout its global supply chain. By assembling these executives behind the president, the American government inadvertently provided Beijing with a live audience for whom Xi's opening warning about Taiwan was not an abstraction, but a direct calculation of commercial risk. This was leverage applied with surgical precision, addressed not only to the American head of state, but to the commercial elite whose presence in Beijing itself demonstrated how deeply American industry is embedded in the Chinese economic order. The geopolitical context within which this summit was embedded had been systematically shaped by a series of decisions and events stretching back to late February of 2026. On February 28th, the United States launched Operation Epic Fury, a military campaign that China was not notified of in advance. This absence of prior consultation accomplished two simultaneous strategic objectives for Beijing. First, it furnished China with a defensible posture of non-participation. The Chinese government could credibly assert that it bore no responsibility for outcomes in a conflict it had not been consulted about or asked to sanction. Second, it preserved for China the freedom to select its own role in the aftermath of the operation, rather than having that role defined by American expectations. The war that followed drove President Trump's domestic approval rating to 33%, pushed national gasoline prices above $4 per gallon, and consumed the political capital that the administration required to advance its broader foreign policy agenda. Crucially, the conflict also made Chinese diplomatic cooperation indispensable. Any viable framework for ending or stabilizing the Iran situation required Beijing's participation, given that China accounts for approximately 90% of Iran's oil export revenues, operates the payment infrastructure that sustains the Iranian economy in defiance of American sanctions, and has enacted a blocking statute that formally nullifies American financial law as it applies to Chinese refineries processing Iranian crude. In the week preceding the summit, China's foreign minister hosted his Iranian counterpart in Beijing and received a full briefing on the American negotiating position. Beijing, in short, arrived at the summit not merely as a commercial partner, but as the indispensable intermediary through which Washington's most urgent foreign policy objective, a resolution to the Iran conflict, could be advanced. The price of that intermediary role was left conspicuously unstated in public, but was structured into the very architecture of the meeting. A second dimension of China's accumulated leverage derives from its management of rare earth mineral exports, a domain in which China's dominance of the global supply chain has transformed a natural resource advantage into a geopolitical instrument of the first order. In 2025, during an earlier phase of Sino-American trade tensions that had driven tariffs past 140%, Beijing threatened to restrict the export of rare earth minerals and magnets, materials essential to the production of American precision weapon systems, consumer electronics, and electric vehicles. The Trump administration, confronted with this prospect, chose to reduce tariff escalation rather than accept the risk of supply disruption. This outcome was not lost on the participants assembled in the Great Hall of the People. Musk was present and understood the implications for Tesla's manufacturing. Huang was present and understood the implications for NVIDIA's production. Cook was present and understood the implications for Apple's supply chain. Xi's opening warning that Taiwan's mishandling would destabilize the entire bilateral relationship was therefore not merely a diplomatic statement about geopolitical principles. It was an implicit reminder, delivered before an audience with skin in the outcome, that the economic consequences of confrontation would fall disproportionately on the American companies whose chief executives were seated directly behind the president. Beijing's preparatory talks with American trade envoys, led by Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and his Chinese counterpart, have produced what Chinese state media describe as overall balance and positive outcomes. Yet the official Chinese readout from the summit itself carried a phrase of considerably greater strategic weight: strategic stability. In the lexicon of Chinese state communication, strategic stability does not denote a condition of mutual equilibrium. It denotes a condition that Beijing offers and that Washington must come to Beijing to purchase at a price determined by the provider. The matter of the Taiwan arms package illuminates, perhaps more clearly than any other single data point, the gap between formal American commitments to Taiwan's security and the operational conditions under which those commitments are actually discharged. In October 2025, the Trump administration approved an $11 billion weapons package for Taiwan. As of the date of the Beijing summit, 7 months after that approval, the package had not begun to be delivered. 7 months of administrative non-fulfillment, occurring against the backdrop of an ongoing Iran conflict, a scheduled and repeatedly postponed summit with Beijing, and a president who publicly characterized his relationship with Xi Jinping in terms of personal friendship, constitutes a pattern that Taiwan's government could not reasonably interpret as coincidental. The Taiwanese government's official response to the summit was notably careful in its construction. Rather than affirming confidence in American security guarantees, Taipei stated only that it viewed actions contributing to regional stability positively, and that the United States had repeatedly reiterated its stated position of support for Taiwan. The formulation is telling, not a declaration of trust, but an acknowledgement of reiterated statements. Not an assertion that the arms package would be delivered, but a careful avoidance of any such assertion. 7 months of unfulfilled commitments, one social media post that broke with the 6 assurances framework, and a summit opening in which the American president praised the man most opposed to Taiwan's defense as a great friend. Together, these elements have produced from America's most directly exposed security partner a statement of the most carefully hedged character imaginable. Xi Jinping's invocation of the Thucydides trap in the opening statement of the summit was not a casual academic reference. Xi has employed this framework on prior occasions, including in 2014, but its deployment in the inaugural public exchange of the most consequential bilateral summit in nearly a decade carries a specific and calculated set of messages. The Thucydides trap, as developed by Allison's research, holds that in 16 of the 17 historical cases in which a rising power has challenged an established one, the outcome was war. By invoking this framework, Xi accomplished several strategic objectives simultaneously. He positioned China as the responsible and far-sighted actor, one seeking to avoid a historically determined pattern of conflict. He implicitly cast the United States as the incumbent established power, whose behavior constitutes the primary variable requiring adjustment if the trap is to be escaped. He identified Taiwan, the issue he raised immediately thereafter, as the most important question in the bilateral relationship, as the precise mechanism through which the trap would close if mishandled. And he asked the President of the United States on the record and before a global audience whether the United States was capable of managing the relationship with sufficient wisdom to transcend the historical precedent. This is not a philosophical inquiry. It is a strategic demand articulated in the language of political philosophy. The demand is that Taiwan be managed on terms acceptable to Beijing. The consequence of refusal is framed not as Chinese aggression, but as the inevitable product of American failure to escape the trap that history has set. That Trump's response to this framework was to reaffirm the honor of the friendship underscores the degree of asymmetry that defined the summit's opening posture. One leader arrived with a strategic doctrine. The other arrived with a relationship. Doctrines, in diplomacy as in history, tend to determine outcomes. The announced American objectives for the summit, securing Chinese commitments to purchase American soybeans, beef, and commercial aircraft, and establishing a board of trade to manage bilateral commercial disputes, stand in stark relief against the terms that Xi's opening statement established. Washington arrived seeking specific, domestically salient commercial deliverables that could be announced before the November midterm elections. Beijing's first public words established that Taiwan was the main event, and that commercial deliverables were the reward available to Washington upon satisfactory handling of the main event. The imbalance is structural. The American side framed the commercial transactions as the summit's primary substance. The Chinese side established that the primary substance was Taiwan, and that the commercial transactions were derivative of its resolution. As the Center for Strategic and International Studies, Scott Kennedy observed, although expectations for a grand bargain were low, the welcoming ceremony and initial remarks highlighted the truly consequential nature of the relationship for the broader international order. The governments of Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Australia, each with distinct equities in the summit's outcomes relating to Taiwan, semiconductor export controls, South China Sea maritime language, and AUKUS submarine cooperation respectively, were watching and calibrating. The summit's ceremonial dimensions, including the state banquet, the visit to the Temple of Heaven, and the formally announced commercial agreements, provided the visible architecture of diplomatic success. The substantive outcomes, concerning the Taiwan arms package, the Iran deal framework, the rare earth supply chain, and the specific language of the joint communique on Taiwan would emerge from the rooms the cameras did not enter. The 75 days preceding the Beijing summit were not a period of random diplomatic drift. They constitute a coherent arc of strategic preparation in which China systematically accumulated the leverage necessary to arrive at this summit in the position of the party that defines the terms on which outcomes are possible. The non-notification of China at the outset of Operation Epic Fury provided Beijing with justificatory distance. The American commercial dependence on Chinese markets and supply chains provided the mechanism by which business executives were enlisted as structural participants in Beijing's leverage calculation. The rare earth precedent of 2025 established the credibility of China's willingness to use economic instruments for strategic purposes. The Iran war's domestic political costs established the depth of Washington's need for Chinese diplomatic assistance. The 7-month non-delivery of the Taiwan arms package established a precedent of conditional commitment. And Xi's deployment of the Thucydides trap in the opening moments of the summit established the philosophical and strategic frame within which all specific negotiations would be conducted. The trap was not a conspiracy or deception. It was a configuration of interests, pressures, and timelines that Beijing managed its way into through consistent strategic patience, and that closed at the moment Trump and Xi exchanged handshakes before the booming ceremonial cannon and the school children waving American and Chinese flags. What emerges from this summit, in the private rooms, in the post-departure readouts, in the language of the joint communique, will determine the shape of the post-war international order in the Indo-Pacific. What is already evident from the first public exchange alone is the degree to which the terms of that order are being set not by the party that opened with friendship, but by the party that opened with a warning.